Bonsoir. Good evening. I'm David Allen Patali, and this is the Libby Book Club for WA. And tonight, my guest is author Kirsty Manning. We're here to talk about her book, The Paris Mystery, which is reversed for you, but the cover's stunning, and we're gonna talk about the cover a little bit later and an alternate cover. Kirsty, welcome to the Libby Book Club for WA. How you going?
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. And just to point out, tonight's edition of the Libby Book Club for WA is actually part of a thing called Love to Read, which is where book clubs from across Australia are all reading the Paris Mystery, not at the same time, but in the same month. And Kirsty's going to be speaking to Libby book clubs right around Australia to talk to them, but we get to have her all to ourselves tonight. Now, before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I am broadcasting to you tonight from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Now, Kirsty, where do I start with this book? There is so much to it. There's so much that went into creating it. There's so much, it's Paris, it's mystery, 1938, pre-World War II, female empowerment, feminism, journalism, haute couture, fantastic designer gowns. Before I continue, Julian's just corrected me. It's called Together We Read. Sorry, not Love to Read. It's called Together We Read. And if you would like to ask a question or make an observation tonight, please jump in the chat. This is totally interactive. Now, Kirsty, where did the inspiration for the Paris Mystery come from? Did it come from things that you love or something that you saw? Or is it a combination of things that you've always wanted to do?
I think, it came about, I started writing this book. I pitched it to my agent and my publisher in lockdown, which, as all of you would know, we were in lockdown for a long time in Melbourne and a couple of years. and I was writing quite, my big historical books. But what I found I was reaching for comfort and for joy, I was watching a lot of mysteries on TV. I was reading a lot of mysteries. And I've always enjoyed crime and thriller stories, whether it be on the screen or on the page. And I've always wanted to try my hand at writing a crime book. But I was a few books in and I had contracts and I wasn't sure where to start. So I just said, I said to my agent, I'd like to try writing a crime book. And she said, what kind of crime book? What are you talking about? And I said, she said, well, what about historical? And I said, it's funny you should say that because being locked down, I was also doing a lot of armchair travel. I was looking at lots of island resorts. And Paris. Like Paris is always kind of a go-to place. We have a restaurant and wine bar in Melbourne. I like food and wine. I like fashion. And, I just spent a lot of time scrolling through random stuff, basically, online to kind of kill time because we had to stay inside. And I did that and a lot of walking in my 5-kilometer zone. Oh. And I just started noodling about this idea of a woman in Paris. And I had a friend who had been a correspondent. And I started thinking about Paris and what era of history was great. And I just thought that pre-war time, when Gertrude Stein was there, Hemingway was there, it was really quite a decadent, glorious time. There are a lot of writers. It's famous for that period, having writers there. And at the same time, I read a lot of memoir. I read biography and memoir. And I was reading a book, a collection of articles by one of the New Yorker's first correspondents, a journalist by the name of Janet Flaneur. And she's just very, very funny. She's very sharp. She's very witty. She writes in that, cutting, ironic, really cynical way that, Hemingway maybe touched on in his journalism, but she really nailed. Like, she was the queen of it. She had a column for 30 years, I think, with the New Yorker. And I thought, I want to emulate that style of writing. I want to write a journalist, and I wanted to be like Janet Flaneur. And I looked at the era she started writing that, and it's a funny time to set a book in pre-war Paris because it's 38. And of course, you've got Churchill over in England saying to people, because of course he wasn't PM then, you know, he's saying, we need to watch out for the Germans, they're rebuilding. And meanwhile, everyone in Paris is drinking champagne. They're just getting over the Great War, as it became known. And there's that naivety. So I like that interplay, I think, very much as a writer, where as readers and as people outside the novel, you know what's going to play out in the years to come, but my characters do not. Like, they are naive, and it's that gloriously hedonistic, free era in Paris. And I thought I want to capture that.
I really enjoyed that element you just touched on, where, yeah, I love the history of this period, and I knew what was coming, but it's that end of the party feeling that nobody quite, they don't know it, but they're about to enter this realm where, you know, everything's about to go very wrong. But just, you know, having Charlotte as the medium for this, someone who is, she's not naive to these things, but, you know, she's someone who has to be introduced to Paris. She's always wanted to be there, but, you know, she's wanting to establish herself as a correspondent. I mean, was that an attractive proposition for you in writing Charlie? You know,
it was. I mean, it had a number of facts. There was precedence in that at the time there were a lot of well-known, and in fact, one of the journalists who broke the story for the First World War was an Australian journalist, and there were female journalists that worked in the field. So there's historical, I guess, gumption for that, because in reality there were a number of women working in the field in the war. They dressed as sappers. They were quite chameleons. And when you're writing a murder mystery, a crime, it becomes a function, you know, you need the person whose perspective you're telling the story through to be able to get to places. Like, it's a practical fact of writing. So you know, if she had been a French police officer, they were terribly conservative. She wouldn't have been out in the field. She wouldn't have been able to investigate. So I felt like, as a journalist, she had agency over the way she spent her time during the day. She was pretty mobile. She was an astute observer. So all of those qualities you could build into it is quite a handy starting place for a story, because, you know, they've got to be on the move.
And very tough. I loved how in your acknowledgements you called out Martha Gellhorn. She's one of my heroes. I was a journalist for years, so
yeah. And, you know, I actually have like, there's a fun scene in the book where I have her going with her mother to listen to one of the journalists speak about her life on the road in the war. So you know, I like to kind of play in my novels with having real people floating through. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, now look, I have to ask you the worst question that always gets answered. What is the Paris mystery about? This is often a that's a question.
It's about, well, it is, well, my pitch to my agent was, I kind of want to write like a sexy Parisian Agatha Christie style. I think in America they call them a cozy mystery or a locked door mystery. So it's set, it opens in a party, it's in, you know, that sense of like on the Orient Express or at a party. And this starts off at a summer solstice masquerade ball. And I wanted to throw Charlie straight into the party because I wanted her to launch into that creme de la creme of Parisian society, or European, really, that world where you're mixing with merchant bankers and artists and designers and landscapers, and that real bohemian mix of high-low that Paris really pulls off. So it's a story of Charlie, an Australian foreign correspondent, leaving behind her life in Australia and arriving in Paris, being sent to this party really just as a meet and greet, you know, the new journalist on the beat. And of course somebody dies, and it is the story of whodunit and chasing the stories of the various exciting characters that unfold across Paris. So
I got to say, I mean, I probably don't look like your typical reader, but I was hooked from like page 1 or 2. You really got me, and I think one of the joys of the Libby Book Club is, I get to read all kinds of books. It's fantastic for me. So this has been a really long and cold and boring winter here in Perth, and I've had a gutful of it. So the past month has been glorious for me. I've been in Paris, 1938, investigating mysteries, hanging out with a glamorous woman. I've had a great time. So
Yeah.
thank
Thank
you
you.
for gifting that. I love that came from your lockdown experience. Where you just wanting to get out, but also to create something that was going to bring warmth to people.
Yeah, I just really wanted a book. Thank you so much. I mean, that's pretty much exactly what I wanted to create. Like one of my, all my books, one of the things I always try and do is really write my setting, bring it to life. I'd kind of almost try and choose each setting in my book as like one of the characters. And with Paris, I really wanted, maybe it was the circumstances I was writing in, but I really wanted people to kind of have a sense of the food, when they're sitting out on the pavement in Saint Germain, to feel the sun on their face, to watch people, in the cafes walking past, to drink their martini. It's just, it's a bit of a joyful, I was driving along today and I was bringing my son back from sport this morning, and I said, it's just, he said, what are you working on? I said, oh, my next murder. It's kind of my next fun kind of murder mystery. And my son looked at me and was like, you're a psychopath. You know that. Like,
we all have a good murder though,
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is that with things like, I'm by no means anything like Agatha Christie, but, this kind of field of Franny Fisher, all of the things, they're always in, the world that they create is always fascinating, whether you're on the Nile or on the Orient or in Franny Fisher's world, like that glamour of Franny. You're moving through this world that you kind of forgive, you kind of lose yourself in, and you're going through this kind of fantastical murder chase that, it's probably not quite how it's done in real life, much more clinical, but readers are willing to go with you because you're giving them, everything else. So it's a fun thing to write. But you do have to also, I did consult with proper journalists in the writing of this book, and they were very helpful in, just explaining the art of the interview and the awkward interview when you're interviewing someone, far more powerful than yourself, and how you just have to like stand off, give a beat, wait for them to fill the void of the silence and things like that, just like little techniques. So beats like that I kind of put into the book. And the fact that I really like the way that Charlie uses kind of everything she's got. I mean, she can be flirty, but she doesn't flirt her way through Paris. She's really got some chops, and she's quite smart. She's manipulative. She thinks outside the box. She has quite a professional relationship with the inspector, a grudging relationship. Eventually she wins his, if not admiration, but grudging respect, I would say.
Well, I really like how observant she is. How she always sees she sees the little things. She's always looking for these things and builds the picture, like the blood on the cufflink.
Yeah.
And just the way she observes her apartment. The moment she walks into the apartment that her job gives her, she looks at the view, but then she goes, "Oh, hang on a sec. It's really hot in here."
Yeah.
Terrible apartment.
Yeah.
I like how she's not overwhelmed by the grandeur of Paris. She loves that, but then she also looks through to see different things. I mean, was she a fun character to write, or a demanding character?
Yeah, it's totally fun. She was totally fun to write. And also, you have to be in that era quite careful, because you know, I know when people watch, for instance, And Just Like That or Sex in the City, and they're like, how do they live in these amazing houses and nobody has a job? And so, like, as you're saying with Charlie in Paris, like, of course she's excited because she's in this city for the first time and she's in this amazing apartment. But then you have to draw attention to the fact that actually, you know, at the end of the day, she is a jobbing journo and a correspondent. She would be in the top cheap flat and there would be, you know, no fans and it would be hot on arrival, so stifling. So, you know, I think those little things just kind of keep people sucked into the reality of the world. It's so easy when you write a historical novel to get it wrong, and then all of a sudden people are frustrated and they're out of the book or out of the place or in the sense. But I need them. It also really humanizes Charlie. It helps her, you know, if she was a cardboard cookie and she was like, oh wow, Paris apartment, you know, that's just you need her to be real, you need her to be likable, and so you've got to put in those little, as you say, those little observations, because that's real life. You know, if you think about friends and people you like, it's their little quirks and the things they say that it's not the big stuff, it's the little stuff that makes you like them.
Absolutely. And Kirsty, the book is doing fabulously. Julianne was telling us just before, Julianne from Overdrive, that, you know, the book is available on Libby. It's the top pick. It's available. The Paris Mystery is available now in the Libby app until the 30th of August. The loans are unlimited and concurrent, and in particular, the audiobook is excellent. I've not heard the audiobook, but are you happy with it? Was it a male or a female narrator? How did it work?
It was a female narrator, and they always get great actors with great accents, and they run everything by you. And yeah, it's a really lovely audiobook. Very, you know, very, very wise voice. It's always hard. Do you go for a young voice? Do you go for an old voice? And I think this particular actor has really nailed Charlie's youthful exuberance, but also wisdom, which is a hard thing to have. I mean, it's funny as an author, like I often, like listen to samples of it, but I don't sit down and listen to the audiobook from beginning to end. My husband once put on one of my audiobooks as a surprise when we were going on a road trip. Okay. And I wanted to climb out the window. No. Not because the audiobook and the reading wasn't delightful, because I was, but as a writer, I just wanted to like I want to change that. You know, so, I mean, that's the thing with a book. It's always evolving. You know, I always joke that I could be rewriting. If my publishers didn't take it away from me, I'd still want to like change a word here or there.
It's true. I say it's never done, only abandoned. It's quite true. Jayho says, I listened to the audio. The narrator was excellent. And Julianne's telling us also that 500 people in WA have already borrowed their ebook, and in WA, 50 people are listening to the audiobook. So
thank you. Yes, it's a wonderful listen.
You're getting people,
you know, you feel like she's very she leans into the French.
Fantastic. And I've got a great comment here from Mike Smallman. He says, thank you for your book. I've read it and enjoyed the story. You have a complex web involving several well-developed characters. I like the place in history, the drama, and the characters' stories. I was able to place myself in Paris and recognize landmarks that revive memories of places I've been. You've also left an opportunity for sequels. Congratulations on such a good write. Totally agree with Mike. I've been to Paris 3 or 4 times. I've not been in years, but it was like I was back there again.
Thank you. Yes, I think you know, you know, as I said before, it's maybe that time that I was writing it, but I was definitely tapping into that nostalgia and familiar and the romance and, you know, all the feels. I wanted to write that. I think I just did an interview in America, and I said to them something like, I wanted to write myself happy. I wanted to like really bring that exuberance onto the page. So thank you to Mike and to you for, you know, good to know it worked.
Totally. And I love that phrase you used for Charlie, useful exuberance. Yeah. Because she's got to figure things out, but she's got to tread some very fine lines, doesn't she? There's a lot of the relationship with her editor, with society, with Lady Ashworth, with Lord Ashworth, all these different very sensitive characters. She's got to tread a lot of minefields almost to get to the heart of things, doesn't she?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think as a journalist working on the beat, it's a very fine line, because you need people to tell you things. You need, especially in a murder investigation, you need the cooperation of the police, who obviously don't want to get it, but they need you to accurately report it. So they don't want you to stuff it up. So it's a symbiotic relationship, but it's one that is, fraught with mistrust in many ways, and still so to this day, because police always think journalists are going to exaggerate or get it wrong, and journalists always think police are trying to conceal all the evidence. So she has to kind of tread that line, and then, as a journalist in Paris who's going to be covering all sorts of stories across the continent, she needs a network of contacts. Your contacts are what make or break you as a journalist, as you would know, and you need to maintain those relationships, and you need to nurture and feed them. And then with the editor, I mean, I know when I worked in-house with publishing houses, but I never worked in-house. I was only ever a freelance journalist, and I know that I would always send work off to the editor, and I'd be really hoping for, something lovely, some feedback of some sort, a nice line about whatever I'd filed. And it's always a gruff, well done, good job. Give me 3 more lines, give me, 400 words. Can you cut that top line off, put more up the top, it's always like gruff and brief and to the point, because they're busy people, not because they're not lovely people. Generally they are, but they don't have time for you. And especially as a freelancer, it's like, you got the job done, fine, that's enough. And so I wanted to tap into that relationship. And of course, there's that bit of a play. She is Charlotte James, but that whole misogynistic workplace back in Australia, where remember in the 1930s, there were a couple of women in the field in Europe working, but they really got themselves there. Back home in Australia, you had to resign when you got married, and you were out of either the secretarial pool. And if you were a journalist or a writer on a newspaper, you're really confined to what was called the women's pages. So you'd be writing about stockings and parties, and which is why she got the party in Paris. But those soft subjects that were in 2 or 3 pages that the women folk read, the section of the newspaper that the women read. And so it was her. There's a bit in the book, I don't think I'm giving anything away, where it's her journalist, her boss, her gruff editor, who puts she gets assigned to a homicide story in Sydney, and she is capable of covering it. Her editor realizes that she more than has the chops to cover it, but she's got to come off the women's pages, and he's worried about the veracity of the story, whether she'll be taken seriously. So he said, just call yourself Charlie James, not Charlotte. And so he gives her that name, that gender ambiguous name, and it sticks. And yeah, so that's how we have Charlie.
It worked a treat. I'm glad she got out of there.
Yeah.
I read my brother Jack about 3 months ago, and it's just, that stultifying Australia of the 1930s and 40s, where you just,
very conservative. But even so, she's writing for British Outpost of a newspaper in Paris, and that actually, that the scene where she arrives in Paris and meets her editor for the first time, and she's shocked, is actually based on a true story. Actually, a friend of mine at university. Pardon?
I had the biggest belly laugh at that. When she the editor shows up and he's like, Charlie?
Yeah. So I wanted to have fun with that because, because of course he was shocked because she didn't explain, and, where would that be on the documentation? And I actually had a friend who went over, I think it was one of her first jobs for the Winter Olympics in Japan, whenever they were, must have been in the 90s. And not long out of uni, and she had grown up in Japan and was a native speaker. And so she was well versed in Japanese, the nuances, the gender codes of Japanese. And so she had been filing for NHK in Australia and just dictating her stories over the phone as he did. And no, I don't know if she must have. Anyway, the editor, she arrived at Tokyo airport to cover the Olympics, and they were very confused that the person who'd been filing the story was a woman, was a young woman. Like, how could she speak Japanese like this? And as an Australian, like, not a Japanese woman. And so it was just, she said, how could they be shocked? Like, she was just confused that they were shocked about who she was, that she wasn't Japanese. And when she got there, and they were like, well, we don't know if we can put you on. You're going to have to be a producer. Like, there's no way. And she said, did somebody not check this before I landed in Tokyo? So,
good on her. Good on her.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, is there a section of the book you could read for us, just to demonstrate, I don't know, Charlie's youthful exuberance? I love that.
I will read you, so as not to give any spoilers, I'll read you a bit where at the beginning of the book, I think it's about 60 pages in, where she's been at the party. She's probably a bit jet lagged, and she's dressed to the nines in couture, and there's been champagne, there's been cocktails, there's about to be a performance. She's met all the people, and she's just withdrawn from the party for a moment to a dark corner of the garden just to collect her thoughts and make notes on all the people she's met, and I guess just let day one of Paris settle. And so here she is, just sitting on a bench, garden bench top, with the music kind of spilling out in the background, and it's quite dark. So she was jotting down notes when she heard a twig snap behind her. "Who's there?" she said, her voice sharp to disguise her fear as she twisted to look around. Approaching her wooden bench was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tuxedo and a plain black mask. A man with the slick back hair and a confident smile. I should say it's a masquerade ball. Like, it's not. That's not a dodgy mask. She's not frightened. Everyone was in masks. Charlie swallowed. She was alone with Edward Rose Thomas. He glanced uneasily over his shoulder. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked. "No," he said a little too quickly. Quite the opposite. He tugged at his collar with his forefinger and loosened his bow tie. His right shirt cuff was stained with droplets of what appeared to be blood. "Are you all right, Commander?" she asked, sitting up. A navy man wouldn't have come to the party with a stained shirt. "I beg your pardon." "Your cuff. It has blood on it. Have you cut yourself?" "Oh," he lifted his arm to examine his sleeve. There was a distinct blood-smeared scratch down his wrist that he quickly pulled his cuff to hide. "I must have brushed against a rose bush." He smiled reassuringly. "Lady Ashworth's arbours are lethal." Then he noticed Charlie's bare feet, his eyes widening, and she tucked them back under the seat with an embarrassed laugh. Stepping closer, he looked at an open notebook on her lap. "May I join you, or are you hard at work? Please, do sit." She held her breath as he sank down close beside her, his muscles strained in his tuxedo pants, and she did her best not to imagine running her fingers along his leg. She clenched and unclenched her fists, something she often did under tables to force herself to focus in interviews. "What are you writing about?" the commander asked. "I'm making a list of contacts and possible sources for down the track." She realized she was stroking the gold edge of Marchand's name tag, a gesture that gave her a strange comfort. I might have trouble putting faces to names, though, given so many of them are masked. The commander leaned back in the bench. If you manage to get an invitation, you'll see them all again in a week at Lady Ashworth's private gala at the Louvre. She's hosting it with Maxime Marchand this year. Last year, she and Miss Goldsmith hosted a dinner among the Egyptian mummies at the Louvre to raise some funds for the Antiquities Division. Lady Ashworth has a list of worthy causes as long as my arm. Mummies? Sounds spooky, Charlie pulled a face. Forgive me for being crass, but how could a reporter fund a party on par with this? She'd already worked out that Millie was from Wealth, but she wanted the details. Miss Goldsmith just covers fashion for a ladies' magazine, he laughed. Her father owns most of Michigan. The Goldsmiths are the largest private traders of agricultural commodities on the Chicago Stock Exchange. Oh, said Charlie, irritated. Miss Goldsmith may come from privilege, but that doesn't mean she can't have her own ambitions, does it? True, conceded the commander. Maybe she writes about fashion because those are the stories women tend to be given. Have you thought of that, Commander Rose Thomas? Even though Millie had been cold to Charlie, she didn't deserve to be belittled by a man who knew nothing of how hard it was for a woman to land a position on a news desk. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to insult Miss Goldsmith or you, Miss James. Thank you, but it's Mrs. James, Charlie said quickly, feeling churlish. She sighed as the thought of the signed divorce settlement papers sitting under the briefing notes in her apartment this week. My apologies again, he glanced at her left hand. I assumed. Charlie shrugged. Is your husband here in Paris? He stayed in Sydney. She took a deep breath. Well, I'm divorced, or I will be, soon enough. In less than a year, her happy life had been destroyed. She closed her eyes and remembered pressing her cheek against her husband's bare chest. She couldn't help but thinking of his easy laugh, his gentle Irish lilt when he told her about funny things that had happened in court. As the warm memories swirled and regret poured at her, she opened her eyes and straightened up. So that's just a little moment of her sitting in the garden, and we start to learn about her backstory. And I won't spoil it because there's a lot more to learn.
No, thank you. That's not part of the Libby Book Club. We don't know who's read, who hasn't, so we can't give away anything, even though I'm desperate to ask you some rather pointed questions. But I think that's a great scene. That gives us a taste of everything there. It's Charlie's history, the divorce back in Australia, some of the relationships that she's having to manage. I love that line. Maybe she writes about fashion because those are the stories women tend to be given. She just cuts straight to it. That's what I love about Charlie. She kind of calls it as she sees it and then goes, oh, maybe I should pull that back a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think I really wanted to capture that. She is a very direct woman, but I mean, I think that's also very Australian. They're very direct and they call it as they see it. I mean, we can come across as being quite blunt when we're, especially in Europe, where they tend to be much more reserved, or they certainly don't always say what they think. But Charlie does say what's on her mind. And, I just wanted to have that interplay where, a woman could be privileged or she could be in America, but she was still over in Paris working in a foreign language on a newspaper. And a rich woman in 1938 didn't do that. So she mightn't have particularly warmed to Millie Goldsmith, but she was certainly going to defend her professionalism and her right to have a career.
Can you tell us a bit about Millie? I think in the previous couple of pages we would have met Millie. She's a very sort of striking, bold and brassy sort of person, right?
So Millie was an American, and on first impression, she's very glamorous, very exuberant, very confident, and unlike Charlie, she's wearing her couture and she looks like she owns it. She really is poured into her dress and moves among the crowd, the men and the women, as if she is one of them. And as the commander points out, she is. She's from money. She belongs at this party. And I think, you know, it's just good to have a foil to Charlie, another young woman, another journalist, and seeing how she goes about her job. Because of course they're both covering the same party. They want to talk to the same people. And they both have different methods. Charlie's just trying to navigate this world, and Millie is of this world. And I think that is why she was sent to do the pages somehow, because she is connected, and it was going to take Charlie a while to catch up and build her own connections.
And if we were to flick maybe, I think, 6 pages beyond where you read, that's when something quite awful happens. But I'm just trying to figure out how to ask you about the murder without asking you about the murder. What can you tell us about Marchand, the man who is is that giving things away? I don't know.
Maybe a little spoiler, but I think the thing with trying to work out who the murderer was being, and what I will say about the murder is that it's a funny thing, because I was trying to work out very early on the book. You need to know obviously who the murderer is, who the main suspect is, who is putting, I guess, the strongest cases forward for being the main suspects. And the way I kind of went about it was trying to work out the most plausible person to be murdered. And then when I ended up writing my way through the suspects, because they build and they build and they build, and an essential part of a mystery is, of course, the red herrings. You've got suspects, there's like a dozen, well, there's not a dozen in my book, but half a dozen people who could have plausibly murdered the victim. And the way I wrote it was, I wrote it not knowing who the murderer was. I wrote it really believing that 4 people were the murderers. And I wrote it convincing myself that they were the murderer right throughout. And then when I got to the end, that's when it kind of appeared to me. So I thought, if it's a surprise to me, it'll be a surprise to the reader. And then I went back, of course, and I realized that subconsciously I knew from about halfway through who the murderer was. And I had gone about building my case retrospectively.
Oh, that's wonderful. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So trusting the process to reveal it to you, but also your deep instinct.
Yeah, deep instinct. I mean, I wrote one way and I was like, oh, I think this person did it. And I wrote, so you're kind of writing a few different scenarios, and it's very joyful to do that. Like, it's fun to make the case, but also, I mean, that's the part of a murder mystery, right? You do think, oh, did this person do it? And did this person do it? And in order for me to make it believable, I had to write it as though they'd done it. So for me to believe it, I needed to believe it as a writer.
That's fun. So, this is not your first rodeo in writing a book. I think you've got 4. I think yes. 5.
Yeah.
6, soon to be 6.
Soon to be 6. This is next week. The Hidden book comes out.
Yes, so that's coming out next week. Can you tell us about the Hidden book? This is something different?
Yes, well, the Hidden book is a bit of a change of tact. It's back to my kind of dual time frame historical fiction. It is set in World War II, and contemporary Australia. And it's based on a true story, actually. It's based on the story of an artifact that lies in the Sydney Jewish Museum. And what it is a book of photographs that were found wrapped up in a calico sack on a farm in New South Wales, on a family farm. And inside the photo album are photos from Mauthausen concentration camps. So it was Germany, but Austria. And it starts out, like a pretty normal photograph album. and it kind of shows fields and the stone face of the concentration camp. And then they kind of move into darker photographs of prisoners and some of the extreme acts of trauma and torture that happened within the camp, which I don't go into. But so what I really wanted to tell the story was the remarkable thing about this album was, how did it make it out of a concentration camp in Germany to Australia, to a family farm in Australia? And of course, nobody knows how it got there. They don't know who it originally belonged to, but what they did find out was that it was one album of 5 that were made. There were 5 official albums that were made, and they know this because the photographer was forced to, they had concentration camp photographers who took snaps of all the prisoners as they came in, but also took photos of the SS soldiers when they visited the concentration camp. And somebody decided that it would be a lovely act of propaganda and memento if they produced 5 photo albums, identical albums, for each of the top SS soldiers in Germany, like the top brass, basically, which is a horrific gift, like horrific. And the photographer and the people within the camp decided to make a secret 6th book, and that is the one that found themselves out. And what happened was, there was a local Austrian woman and a network of people within the prison who ended up smuggling, I think, something like 20,000 photographs out of the camp. And they hid them in the village with the help of this very brave young woman. And then a lot of those photographs were used actually in the Nuremberg trials to convict a lot of the top SS soldiers. So it's, you know, like all of my books, it's based on fact, pockets of history and fact, but you know, and I don't go too much into the life of the concentration camp. I'm more focusing on the stories of the people who smuggled the photos out. And what it is, it's just the most extraordinary story of hope and courage and, you know, looking forward to the future when every day is almost Groundhog Day. So I wanted to capture that beautiful moment of hope and how you move through a moment. And the other storyline in my book is the story, the fictional story of the family in Australia. The book, you know, ruminating on how maybe the book came to Australia, and the young girl who finds it in her mother's cupboard, and what she thinks when she first looks at the photographs, to her journey into adulthood as she kind of becomes obsessed with this album, and which is hidden from her, but it's Hannah's coming of age story in Australia, kind of touching into that generational trauma. And it's a story about motherhood. It's about her relationship with her mother, and then in time, her relationship with her own children, about all those questions that contemporary women today have about their place in the world, their relationships with other people, all of those complexities, and then how it relates back to her family history in Mauthausen. So I like exploring those cross-generational networks and traumas and family secrets. And, you know, it's always fascinating to me.
Kirsty, what do you think the power of historical fiction is? You know, that does it fulfill a need that we have, or are we able to bring history to life? What do you think?
You know, I'm always reflecting on this, and I think as we journey through life, I think firstly is that there are so many lessons to be learned from reading history, and you can touch into you know, loss and injustice and hope and you know, tragedy and triumph, all of those things. You kind of know how it's played out in history, but you can delve into forgotten pockets of history and kind of tease out how that may have unfolded. I find it enormously comforting in my own life. I mean, I've always read historical fiction, and I still love reading historical fiction. And I think, you know, I like writing contemporary storylines too in my novels, don't get me wrong, but I think that interplay between how people lived, lessons we learned, you know, we're not moving in isolation in our lives. And I think it's very sad if people don't feel connected to the people that came before, and that link back to where you came from, your lineage, your history. I mean, you look at anyone, the story of immigration, that story of being ripped from where you live, and also, you know, our local Indigenous stories as well. It's not, you know, that history, that going back and looking at history and looking at how that unfolded, that's having major consequences today in people's lives. They're unresolved stories, they're unresolved traumas. And I think writing history, and as long as you've got like a big, diverse range of voices doing it, really helps you kind of explore, okay, well, we did this, now we can do this. And I think, but we still don't have the answers, because I've written several books on war now, and you know, there's still war happening, obviously, in the Ukraine and in parts of Africa, and it's quite you know, I think people's appetite maybe for the news sometimes is waning because there's been so much tragedy. But as long as we keep telling those stories and looking at what it means, like those questions of what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to leave your country, what nationalism and loyalty actually looks like, and what does it mean? Is it dangerous? Is it a good thing? You know, we need to keep asking those questions. And I think, you know, there are very many forums where you can do that. You can do that in news forums, you can watch documentaries, but I think art, you know, novels and shows, but especially novels, like we don't, like when I write like my bigger historical books, my purpose is not to answer questions, it's really to ask questions. You know, what would you do to save your family? What does motherhood look like for you? What does it mean to leave your country? What does it mean to leave a country that doesn't want you? What does it mean to be kicked out of your country? You know, all of these questions. And what does that look like? How do you make community? How do you make a life? How do you make a family when you don't have, when you've lost everything? All of those questions, you know, I'm constantly examining, and, you know, I'm still writing the book, so I don't think I've got the answers yet.
It's wonderful, Kirsty. Thank you for sharing. I love that that's how you feel, and that's what you think, you know, and that's how you act and how you write. I mean, what drew you to become a writer? What's, you know, you've clearly got this passion for knowledge and experience, but what made you pick writing as the medium for you to express yourself?
Well, I grew up in the country, and I grew up quite isolated on a farm as a young child. And funnily enough, that's why I'm happy to do the library stuff, because libraries really were my place as a young child, and certainly right through my teenage years, because I was a voracious reader. We were not a family, like we had lovely holidays. We went to the beach once a year. We were by no means sheltered, but our holidays were like to the Murray or to the beach. They weren't European jaunts, you know, and there was an occasional trip to Sydney. And so books really filled my world, really. They gave me a sense of the world. They gave me a sense of history and the way that different people lived. And, you know, you can read everything from, and the librarian was great. She would put, I mean, in the end, she ended up putting, you know, some of the Russian books in my hand. And I would just curl up on the beanbag in Tamworth Library. And you know, I loved reading, but it was also a place that was very air conditioned, and it's very hot in Tamworth in summer. So it was like it was like there or the town pool, the library or the town pool, to be honest. So, you know, it was a good place to kind of, a quiet place to get away from people. It was air conditioned. It was quite, they had comfortable bean bags, and I could borrow as many books as I liked, and the librarian kind of took an interest in me, and she would give me books, book after book. Every week I'd go in thinking I was going to buy, you know, borrow my Sweet Valley High books or whatever, you know, teenage stuff I was reading at the time, really into, playing Betty Bow, or, you know, depending on my age. And she really, you know, and my teachers as well, they really opened me up to the world of writers. And there's one particular, in year 12, actually, this is a very long-winded answer, but I mean, that's what you're getting tonight, isn't it? In year 12, I did an essay on Peter Carey's Oscar and Lucinda. And I don't know whether you've read that or the everyone watching tonight has read it, but I would encourage you to go back and read it, because it is historical fiction, and it's set in the Australian bush. And there's a particular scene in that book where Oscar and Lucinda are on this barge, and they had this ludicrous passion for floating. They brought out this crystal glass house, I guess, and they put it on a barge. I've never forgotten it. I was 17 when I wrote this, and they're sitting on the barge, and they're floating this barge down what I presume to be the Hawkesbury, and you've got the sense of place, you've got the landscape, you can almost smell the eucalypts, the running water, and then there's palpable desire between Oscar and Lucinda, you know, that is, you know, the way he wrote about it was so subtle and so real, and I almost felt pulled underneath by it, and I just was so smitten with that scene, and I thought, wow, that is what writing is. I am here back in, you know, whenever it's set, the 1800s, with a glass structure on a river in the Hawkesbury. You know, there's love, there's setting, there's all of these things. And I just was blown away. And I think because by then I'd read a lot of American books, I'd read a lot of books from other places, a lot of British books. You know, we grew up on a diet, well, we certainly did. There wasn't a lot of Australian literature. I really didn't study much Australian literature until I got to university, but there was Oscar and Lucinda, and it was historical, but it was in my place, and I could recognize the smells and the place, and I could recognize the feelings that these characters had. And it was so powerful and so tender. And I said to my teacher, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to do. And then at university, I read another book, which was Dual Time Frame by A.S. Byatt, a book called Possession. And that is a dual time frame book. And I think I did that maybe in my honours year. And again, a really buttoned up historical fiction, but like just pulsating with desire. And it was about writing, and it was a story within a story, and there were letters, and it was complicated, and it was in different time frames, contemporary and historical. And I thought, I think she actually won the Booker Prize for that, for Possession. So if you haven't read it, readers, I'd add that to your list as well. And I wonder, it would seem very wordy and descriptive now, but it is very descriptive. It's just, you lose yourself in the characters, and again, in the place and in the innermost workings of the mind. And so those two books, really, you know, I'll probably never write anything as amazing as those two books. I would list them both in my masterpiece category, along with Richard Flanagan's Narrow Road to the Deep North. And just will tear you apart. So you know, I read a lot in that area, and you know, you learn how other writers do it. You can't ever replicate those three, unfortunately, but you can certainly learn from the greats and touch in and be inspired by them. And I certainly was. So I think, so that's a long-winded answer. My path to writing came from being a reader. I think every writer is a reader.
I love that. On the beanbags in the Tamworth Library with the air cranked. That's. Could you hold up your book covers, please? You've got a slightly different book cover for the Paris.
Yes. So this is, can you see that? Yeah. That's the Australian cover.
Do you want to hold it a little forward because of the blurring? There you go. Oh, no, a little back now. There you go. Cool. Yep.
That work?
Yep.
That's the Australian cover. And then this is the one I've been in New York last week, and this is the American cover.
Cool.
For the same book.
Why are they different?
Well, it's a good question, but I think in every territory, so wherever my book comes out, whether America or Germany or England, every territory and every marketing team likes to put their own spin on a book. And the American covers are much more jazzy. You know, marketing teams just have a feel for what people pick up in a bookshop. And, you know, it's funny, as a writer, you always have an idea of what the cover will look like, but really you don't have any idea. Like, it's very much the marketing team goes away with concepts, and then they'll come back and present you with a few different ones. And I find that a very joyous part of the process, because it's one that I don't have to do myself. Like,
beautiful.
I find it hard writing the book, so it's quite lovely when the cover comes back to you, and it, you know, it's the magic of your book. So.
Now, Kirsty, we've got like 3 minutes left, okay? But I've got a really good question here from Georgia.
I'll be quick.
Thank you for doing the chat, Kirsty. A few questions. What was the research process like for you writing in a place and time period so different to ours now? Did you travel to Paris, or did you go pouring through archives Natasha Lester style? And do you have any tips for aspiring historical fiction authors like me to research?
Yes. Sure. Well, I am fortunate because I have been to Paris many times, but I'm not sure if you were listening, but I wrote this book in lockdown. So travel wasn't possible then, but it was based on a journalist, her works by Janet Flaneur. So I would suggest, if you have an era or a particular moment in history that you are reading, a lot of my research is done reading primary source material. So I read memoirs written by people at the time in their own voice. I read the work of journalists in that time. And then you get a sense of the cadence of sentences, how they spoke, how they wrote, how they saw the world, because of course how they saw the world and how they reported on the world is very different to how we see it. So I spend a lot of time reading the literature of the time. I look at a lot of photographs. I'm a very visual person, so I will look at places, parties. There was a book, Elsie de Wolfe, a memoir of Elsie de Wolfe, who was a great interior designer in New York. She's the basis of Lady Ashworth. I read her memoir. There's millions of photographs of her at decadent parties in couture online. So I do all of that. And then I research local foods, you know, and then if I'm writing like for the hidden book about Mauthausen, and the places to start are like the Jewish Museum, Holocaust museums. There's museums and libraries are really quite extraordinary, because I think people are going back to them, and they house a great deal of artifacts and information. And once you start asking people if they can help you track down what you need, they're very helpful, and they're often quite interested in what you're writing. So,
Kirsty, we're out of time, but I really appreciate your answer, and thank you for your time tonight. I know you just got back from a promo tour. Where is it in New York? And quite jet lagged. So thank
I
you.
am, but I'll probably be bouncing off the walls now for the next 20 minutes.
Well, look, thank you very much. The Paris Mystery is available on Libby Book, on the Libby app. You can download it or get the audiobook as well. And a lot of people are. I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I really can't wait for your new one, which is coming out on next week. And it will be available on Libby on the 1st of September, The Hidden Book, audiobook and ebook.
Yes.
And Kirsty, just final question, very quick. We're getting a sequel?
Yes. Working on it now. Here are my cards.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, in progress.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for your time tonight. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. I thoroughly enjoyed doing this.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Right.